Welcome to Charge Ahead. VPPs transform EVs from grid challenge to solution. My name is Peter Asmus. I'm the Director of Strategic Marketing at AutoGrid. During the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. Just look for the icon at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to bring relevant questions into the conversation or address them at the end. During the Q&A. If we run out of time, we'll also get back to you with an answer to your question via email. You can also communicate with us, both myself and the panelists, through the chat window, which will be monitored throughout the webinar. After we wrap up, we'll share the recording of the webinar, and feel free to forward the recording to your other colleagues. We're joined today by Joanne O'Neill and Mimi Gupta, who each bring a wealth of industry experience and technical expertise. Welcome, Joanne and Mimi. So to kick things off, let's just let you introduce yourselves. So let's start with Joanne. Joanne, tell us about yourself.
Great. Thank you, Peter. And I'm going to apologize to everyone in advance. I have some severe allergies, so ignore the sniffles, but luckily not contagious, or certainly not contagious over the webinar. But I am Joanne O'Neill. I am the Director of Customer Programs at Clean Power Alliance. I've been in the industry for about 15 years now, focused on demand side or customer side resources and how to advance decarbonization. And so that includes kind of a diverse set of experiences at nonprofit, at a large investor-owned utility, a consulting firm, and then now at Clean Power Alliance. And so in my role at CPA, I'm fortunate enough to lead an amazing team of energy specialists who are focusing on delivering customer programs to our communities in kind of a few key categories, which I'll touch on in a little bit too, but resiliency and grid management, building and transportation electrification, and local procurement. I'll pass it over to Mimi.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Hi, I'm Mimi Gupta. I'm AutoGrid's e-mobility business lead. So I've been in the industry since probably the beginning of my career, where I started at Navigant Consulting, now Guidehouse, working with the Department of Energy and utilities and on energy efficiency programs and standards. And I think over time, I realized what's important is not only how much energy you use, but also where, when, and how you use it. And that brought me to AutoGrid, where I now lead our e-mobility strategy. So that includes working with utilities, OEMs, and fleets, and how best to harness the flexibility of EVs to provide greater grid reliability, while also opening up opportunities to positively engage with their customer base.
Great. All right, well, let's dive in. So to start with, we're going to just sort of set the stage a little bit with some basic information. To start with, Joanne, community choice aggregators, many of us in the industry know what a CCA is, but for those who don't, why don't you tell us a little bit about it, and then more specifically about the Clean Power Alliance?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Clean Power Alliance is a community choice aggregator, or CCA. So maybe a new acronym of the day for some of you joining us. And basically what this means is that in California, communities can pool their electric use and elect to have either create their own CCA or join a CCA that will enable them to develop clean local energy projects, providing economic generation jobs, access to clean energy, but also provide additional programs that are specifically tailored to fit their communities, which is what here talking to you about today. And CCAs across California, which we are one, serve about 11 million customers. So certainly growing to a large share of the generation capacity in the state. And just really quickly, I threw that diagram in the bottom to illustrate how it works. But as I mentioned, we procure energy on behalf of our customers. The investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, are still responsible for ultimately maintaining the grid and transmitting that energy. And then the customers benefit from that local choice and the clean energy and competitive rates. So just wanted to give that little bit of overview so you have context in terms of kind of where our perspective lies. And we can go to the next slide to learn a little bit more about CPA. So we're a public agency formed through a joint powers authority for the Los Angeles and Ventura counties in Southern California, which consists of about 32 communities, soon to be 35 next year. And we're the largest CCA in the state, and actually the fourth largest load serving entity or electricity provider in California. So with that, we serve 3 million customers, again, in the Southern California region, and a really exciting and diverse customer base, as you can guess through the illustration of that map there. One of the things that we're most proud about is that we are actually the leading utility when it comes to the number of customers that we serve that are receiving 100% clean energy. Hopefully we won't hold that title for very long as more people join into that. And then next slide, please. I just wanted to give a quick context in terms of, where my thinking is and where some of the programs we'll talk about today fit into CPA's plans. And so we adopted a strategic plan, Local Programs for a Clean Energy Future, back in 2020. And that called for $20 million of investment in our communities through our programs. And, what's really interesting about our conversation today is that it really crosses over, different categories. So we have resiliency and grid management, which is incredibly important to us, especially here in California, as we face kind of unprecedented wildfires, grid strain, and other things that lead to us really looking carefully at that category. Building and transportation electrification as a key way to decarbonize, and local procurement as a way to help our customers be part of that solution. And so, the conversation today really crosses over multiple categories. And, I think that's really interesting. Mimi talked about kind of her beginnings in energy efficiency. I did as well, and had a similar kind of moment of realization that it's not so simple as one resource anymore, and we really need to bring all of our tools to the table to fight the climate challenges that we're facing today. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mimi.
Yeah, Mimi. So I guess AutoGrid has a history of working with CCAs. I guess I would just observe that I remember when the law was passed for CCAs, it was a long time ago, and it took quite a while for the CCAs to kind of gain traction. And now I believe that at some point in the near future, almost a majority of the Iowa customers will be served by CCAs. But that's just a little historical footnote. So Mimi, what has AutoGrid done with CCAs? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the products and services and how they kind of help CCAs meet their goals.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So AutoGrid is a leading provider of DERMS, Distributed Energy Management System, and VPP, Virtual Power Plant Solutions, to utilities and energy providers across the globe. We were founded in 2010, and since then we've delivered our software and services to more than 50 customers across 17 countries. As of today, we have more than 7,000 megawatts under management, and that includes behind the meter assets like thermostats and storage and electric vehicles, and also front of the meter assets like utility scale storage and renewables. We see CCAs like CPA as a great opportunity to spur the deployment of VPPs, because their missions of clean, reliable energy and further engagement with the community is so in line with what we think virtual power plants provide. And so I think, we're really excited to be working with CPA on delivering a virtual power plant solution that includes all types of behind the meter assets.
Great. One thing I guess historically, I remember when CCA started, and I was a little bit involved with the first one in Marin County, MCE, which now is expanded, is the focus was really just on buying wholesale power, usually greener power than what was available. But now and I think this is why there's an opportunity for deeper collaboration with AutoGrid. They are looking more at DERs. They are looking more at demand response for a variety of reasons. But Mimi, you mentioned virtual power plant. I think all of us in the industry know this term. It's become kind of hype. DOE has been saying a lot about it. There's been a lot of articles, but maybe just to level set, what is a VPP? My wife always wondered, like, where are these virtual power plants? How come can you see these virtual power plants? So define it for us, just so folks know what we're talking about.
Sure, yeah. And let this definition now be etched in stone as the definition.
Sure.
So to me, a virtual power plant is basically an aggregation of distributed energy resources, whether it's front of the meter or behind the meter, that can be dispatched to provide flexible capacity or ancillary services, just like a system operator would dispatch a gas or an oil-fired peaker plant. But instead of that paying for that peaker plant's fuel costs, you're now putting that money back into the community in the form of incentive payments to your customers to curtail their demand or to take control of their storage device. And so here on this slide, you can see with CPA, we're delivering just that, a mixed asset virtual power plant comprised of storage, thermostats, EVSEs, and behavioral demand response to serve as resource adequacy for CPA. So the solution that we work with CPA on includes not only Flex, our software platform, but an array of end-to-end support services that we find is very helpful for the CCA community and other types of energy providers. And that includes program design support, customer recruitment, incentive payouts, and ISO market interaction. And I think this brings us to where EVs come into play. EVs are going to be a huge load and a huge opportunity for these virtual power plants. So, today they maybe represent a small portion of that, but we're definitely going to see that grow over time.
Sure. And I remember when folks were first talking about EVs, it was almost always viewed as a problem. And this is one of the themes of this webinar, like, oh my gosh, these EVs, they're this equivalent load of on home. And so as these EVs pop up on the distribution grid sort of unpredictably, it was always sort of viewed as a problem. But I guess what we're trying to say on this webinar, at least with the right technology and market structures, they actually become solutions. And in some ways, one might argue, one of the most amazing possible solutions for things like resiliency, reliability, and balancing the grid. But Joanne, you were an early adopter of VPPs, and you are using this concept of the turnkey VPP, which is a rather recent sort of twist on the VPP, as opposed to someone buying the software license, just the software license. Now what AutoGrid saying is that actually they will handle enrollment, settlement, sort of the whole, where as much as the client wants the value stream. So how do, from a CPA perspective, how do VPPs sort of fit into this VPP kind of concept for you?
Yeah, great question. And, I think kind of stepping back a little for CPA, it was really important that we had a comprehensive customer solution. And so I'll talk about some of those elements, but while it's comprehensive and probably complex, that didn't appear that way to them, right? And so there's kind of one customer-facing brand, and synchronized messaging so that they don't have to worry about all the terms I'm about to throw out. But our program consists of numerous pathways. We have automated demand response, ADR, but also, as Mimi mentioned, a behavioral approach. It serves residential customers, commercial customers, and we also have a element geared towards multifamily properties. And so within the ADR framework, we have EBSE vendors, storage vendors that we can leverage as resources to call upon during an event. But one of the areas I'm really excited about, and an area that I think increases the accessibility of this type of program, is our behavioral approach. And so within that, you don't need to have a smart device. We don't even really need to have Wi-Fi, right? Just to be able to get the email or phone, email or text, to be able to respond to events by, adjusting your behavior. And EV charging is a huge component of that. It can be, a significant load during, peak times, especially when people aren't thinking about it, right? They plug in whenever they need to, or whenever they have access. And so that additional messaging can really help leverage those resources. One of the other areas that I think we're really excited to kind of explore right now is how do we integrate, managed charging solutions into the portfolio, and make sure that it's not just reducing charging or asking people to not charge during those 4 to 9 hours, but really helping them manage the solution to how they do that charging while still getting the charge that they need to do whatever they need to do with their car, right? The goal of the car is probably to help them get groceries or pick up their kids or go to work, not to necessarily be our resource. And so the more we can make it easy for them to do that, the better off I think we all are. I think there's very few people like myself who actively knows when to plug in and unplugs, and convinces my husband to let me control that. But the more we can automate those type of things, the better off I think these programs will work. And it was actually very timely. Earlier this week, I think it was yesterday actually, I was at a California Energy Commission virtual workshop on goal setting for the load shifting capabilities. And one of the notes in that study is that EVs represent the largest kind of single appliance or device opportunity for load shifting in the state. And as we're at what I think 1.5 billion EVs and growing quickly. And so, I think we really need to get our hands around, how do we leverage these resources, but how do we do it in a way that is easy for our customers to understand, to engage with, and is, and we'll talk about this more later, but is equitable as well and gives everyone access to participate and benefit from these programs.
Right. Well, a couple reflections on what you said. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges with EVs. There's all this potential, but of course they are mobile, and so they move around, and when will that grid resource be there? So that's why a lot of the early opportunities are focusing on fleets, where there are larger, and also with larger batteries. Buses have a firm schedule, so you actually know when that bus is moving, when it's parked. And so this is something that people are just starting to figure out, but there is a lot of potential. As you mentioned, California already 1.5 million EVs. There's mandates to I forgot what the exact dates are, but something like 2030, 2035. There's even a bill that was introduced and passed this week by a 10-to-1 vote that would make those EVs bidirectional, I think within 5 years, or some sort of mandate. Of course, as it goes through the legislative process, that could get changed. Now, there is a few questions coming in. One is, can you help put EVs into perspective? If AutoGrid is managing 7.6 gigawatts now, how much do you think EVs will represent in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? That's very speculative, and of course that's going to depend. But I don't know if anyone, Mimi, or if you want to. I think right now EVs are a pretty small part of the total pie, but it's such a big resource, and that's why we're talking about it now, is somehow figuring out ways to leverage those resources. So I don't know, Mimi, did you want to address that question in any way?
Well, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head of the load expectations for EVs, right. But if I do my job well, it'll
Good
represent
answer.
At least 50%, I think, of our total flexible load, in my opinion.
Right. Of course, what we like to say is the very first DER asset, I guess, plugged into the AutoGrid platform was an EV, I believe, way back in 2012.
That's right. Yeah,
so
it was a ChargePoint EVSE.
Yeah, and that's over 10 years ago. So obviously we've come a long way in those 10 years. I mean, God knows what things will look like 10 years from now. And there's another question here, I guess, before if each EV equals a house and load, is it really feasible for renewables and VPPs to keep up with increasing demand? I don't know, Mimi, if you want to address that, I would say, yes, it is feasible. I don't know if Mimi you want to add, or Joanne, I want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you look at our load curve, our system load curve, the problem is generally not the base load capacity. It's how much that peak load issue, the peak is increasing, and so being able to manage as EVs as a new load can actually help that, I think.
Mhm.
And I don't think we have a problem with overall demand, though.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe I'd add to that this is why it's so important that we're not just adding load without thought and kind of whenever and wherever. The time that load is added is critical to that equation. I think the last few weeks we had record curtailment in California of our solar production facilities because there was more energy than we needed during certain times of the day. And so these could be a potential solution to be able to leverage that if done correctly. But again, asking every fleet owner, every vehicle owner to kind of independently go and do something is very challenging. And so the more that we can, if not impossible, right? But so the more that we can, build systems and tools to enable that, I think the better off we all are.
Yeah, and I think thing we should point out is we're not looking at EVs all by themselves as a solution. The beauty of the VPP model is that you can aggregate with rooftop solar, with various demand response. And it's sort of the whole idea is that all those DERs have certain characteristics. They're not all equal, but when they're brought together, there's a lot of synergies. And so that's kind of the way I think we're looking at it. And as you point out, if it's true that if we electrify and everyone comes home at 5 o'clock and plugs in their EV without any thought, and the sun is going down at certain times of the year, that's where the challenge is. And that's where the solutions like AutoGrid Flex can modulate that. And there can be also market structures that incentivize people to not all plug in at the same time or whatever. So, I think that's what we're looking at, is this sort of distributed, decentralized energy future where EVs then are sort of the latest wrinkle to that evolution. But Joanne, we already talked about how many EVs are coming on the road, more are coming on. So, what other issues is CPA facing when it comes to your specific service territory with EVs? Are you having major issues yet, or are you more sort of planning for the future and trying to get all your ducks in a row, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. And I think I'll answer it in a couple different lenses. The first being kind of the customer or market perspective, and the second being more of the CPA operational perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And, me personally, and I think many of us on the call, I would never call more EVs a problem or a challenge, right? It's an opportunity. It's something that we absolutely need to work towards. And, one of the challenges I see there is that EV penetration continues to expand, as is, charging networks, although potentially not as quickly as we need them. But, unfortunately, that expansion continues to be focused on, the more affluent customers and communities, or those who can enable home charging as homeowners. And so, particularly interested in how we can ensure low and moderate income customers, those in multifamily dwellings, have access to electric vehicles and to charging. And ultimately our public charging networks just aren't quite there yet. And what we see a lot in Southern California is where, even if there are chargers, there's a lot of challenges with uptime, or those chargers being available, which, kind of diminishes the faith that the customers and the community has in being able to charge, which will only slow our growth. So, those are some of the kind of market challenges I see from an operational perspective. We were just talking about it, right? The increased load growth does mean that we have to integrate that into our procurement planning. It does mean that managing that load growth and the new load is incredibly important to us. And so as we continue to promote electrification of transportation, that's a big element in terms of how do we make sure that that there are additional options for that load management. And, you know, in some cases, although it's very popular, you know, DC fast charging isn't the best solution, right? There's a lot of opportunity for you know, level 2 charging options, and you know, making sure that we're thinking through the application so that we not only minimize the draw and the impact of the grid, but also the cost of developing those resources.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, we have another question here. I guess this is probably one for Mimi. From a single building's perspective, does it make sense to combine EV load with the building load for demand response management or VPP management, or does it depend on each site? What would you say to that, Mimi?
I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot of benefits to combining the EV load with all different types of assets, whether it's the building load or you know, any storage as a way to provide flexible capacity. You're going to see that a lot of these customers that were enrolling in EV programs have multiple types of flexible devices. I think like in terms of, I think as you think about EVs though, you need to also think about that this device is there to provide another capability, which is mobility for the customer. And that has to be a key part of any program that a utility or even an OEM tries to start. How do you ensure that you're maintaining that level of service, the mobility service for the customer, and taking into account that when they want to be fully charged by, at what charge level, and that's going to be critical for the success of any program.
True. Now, you know, we talked a little bit about one of the challenges, well, maybe it's not challenges, one of the unique aspects of EVs is their mobility, unlike other resources like a stationary battery, for example, which you might have at your home. You know, in some ways, though, when you think about it, these EVs are batteries on wheels. So that mobility, though, could be a good thing and could even help address equity issues in some ways. I think there's a scenario some people are talking about where larger EVs, these batteries on wheels, could be moved to a community center in a frontline community or something to provide resiliency during a power outage. You know, that's kind of more forward looking, but some people are looking at that. So, but that sort of starts going to this idea of V2G, vehicle to grid. Does either one of you want to talk a little bit about that? How real is that? And, you know, how does that really work, V2G?
Sure. I mean, I can talk a little bit about it.
Sure.
So I believe V2G is real. I mean, I think the industry talks about it in a lot of terms: vehicle to grid, V2X, and it's essentially basically using the storage capacity of a electric vehicle to provide, you know, grid services like an energy storage, a stationary storage battery might. And that can be by providing resiliency in the case of an outage, which you see like the Ford F-150 being marketed to do. That can be providing energy back into the building or to the home to do time of use or demand charge management optimization. Or that could be exporting back into the grid to provide additional capacity. And I think, you know, we're still at the early stages. AutoGrid has a couple pilots going in the electric school bus area on V2G, which we're really excited about. But, you know, what we really need to see is more equipment that's V2G capable come out, and make sure that it's at a manageable cost point for consumers, whether it's like a home consumer or a fleet to adopt, in order for it to become really prolific. And also we need to see the markets compensate that capacity appropriately.
Right. I think that's actually one of the biggest issues right now. I know there is a program in California, but it's fairly limited, kind of a pilot project. So you're right, to make that really happen, we need to have more, again, even with VPPs in general, we have the technology, but what you also need are the right incentives, the market structures, so that there is a compensation scheme for providing those different services. So we want to talk, we already touched upon a little bit, one of the big issues with things like EVs is equity issues, making sure that some of these new technologies are not just going to the sort of affluent first adopters, but as part of that, let's do a little poll here. I think we have the ability to do a poll. Yes, here we go. So let's do a poll, and then I'm going to ask Joanne a question. So here we have a poll about equity. How important is it to you to address equity in your EV program? And so while folks are weighing in, you know, CCAs, because they are locally controlled by usually city county governments, you know, want to address equity issues. EVs are not cheap, obviously. Now the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, does have some incentives, including incentives for used EVs, which will probably help some middle class folks maybe consider that. But Joanne, what is CPA? How are you dealing with this issue of equity? Tell us a little bit about how you're looking at that issue.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's no silver bullet. I think that has to be a lot of strategies deployed. One thing I did want to kind of circle back to, something that Mimi said earlier, is that you have to remember that these are first and foremost a way for people to have mobility, right? To go to their jobs, to get groceries, to handle childcare, whatever the case may be. And so we really have to, you know, anytime we're thinking about equity, we have to think about how we can add value to their use of these vehicles or their use of their home, whatever the case may be. And that's challenging. And not only, you know, you have the cost barriers, which we talked about, access barriers, but also ultimately the value proposition. And so, you know, the way we're thinking about it is that it has to be kind of addressed in different ways. So the program we've been talking about, our Power Response program, we do have additional incentives available for low-income customers and those in disadvantaged communities. And we are doing a lot of outreach, or we'll be doing a lot of outreach kind of in language and making sure that the whole customer experience can be available to customers who don't have English as their first language. But ultimately, you know, we need more EVs and more chargers in the hands or in the I don't know, garages or streets of people who need them. And so, you know, some of the things we've been thinking about is how do we increase EV charging access at multifamily dwellings or at small and medium businesses and disadvantaged communities, and how do we make sure that they have the technical assistance and support that they need to do that, and obviously the incentives to provide that. But, you know, I think just to add more complexity to it, I mean, there's a lot of challenges that come with that too, because if people can't have access to charging at their homes, whether that's because they rent or maybe they're in multifamily dwellings, then they need that public access, and they need that public access to be safe and secure and well lit, so that they feel confident doing that at, you know, the times that they need access to that fuel. So I think it's really a comprehensive solution in how we're looking at equity, and it can't just be through you know, unfortunately, the, you know, VPP program, although we're hoping that by providing additional value streams for the customer, that they can see that not, you know, that there's other ways to reduce costs of ownership by, you know, leveraging those type of incentives.
Sure. Well, it looks like, I don't know. Oh, are people still okay? Here we have the poll. So in terms of the poll, 62% of those who responded said equity is essential. 31% said important but seems difficult, and only 7% said not a consideration. So now, Mimi, in terms of strategies about equity, I mean, I think, you know, one thing that folks don't think about, and we've talked a lot about this at AutoGrid in more higher level terms, is that VPPs can displace fossil fuel peakers. I mean, EVs integrated into VPPs. So there is, you could argue that VPPs in general, if they displace fossil fuel peakers, those fossil fuel peakers tend to be sited in disadvantaged communities. And so ideally, that is providing a value. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. But that's just one point. But Mimi, why don't you follow up on what Joanne said? What kind of strategies are you seeing out in the marketplace or that AutoGrid is looking at in terms of addressing equity issues?
Yeah, and just to follow up on the poll, I think that poll came out just as I expected from talking to a lot of our customers, where they say, equity is oftentimes in their IRP goals, and it's a huge, important issue for them. But a lot of them are like, can we really address equity through EVs, which is like inherently such a premium product already?
Right.
And I think it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that, we can start to chip at. And you're right, Peter, VPPs inherently start to address some of those equity issues by bringing the payments back into the community, by also displacing peaker plants that really affect these marginalized communities the most. But more at a direct level, what I'm seeing other customers do is, target large incentives for marginalized communities. We need to, like Joanne said, we need to, and you said, Peter, we need to keep on top of the used EV market, see how we can continue to promote that, because those will come in at cost points that are much more tenable for these communities. And ensuring, like from an AutoGrid perspective, we're trying to ensure that our ecosystem is able to address the largest swath of consumers possible, not only through, addressing, being able to dispatch these programs via EVSEs, but being able to do it via EV telematics, which brings in this whole new community that doesn't have maybe a connected charger. Also, being able to bring in an ecosystem of partners that address, like Joanne said, multifamily housing. I've lived in multifamily housing my entire life, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't yet own an EV because my multifamily housing just doesn't always have an EV charger, and that needs to change. And so, as AutoGrid, we're identifying partners like Switch, charge CSMS providers like EV Connect and EV Gateway to help address these communities of multifamily housing. So
Sure.
Those are just some of the strategies. It's not an easy task, but I think we can definitely do it.
Yeah, and I know there's a group out there. I think it's called the EV Charging for All Coalition, which is focused on actually affecting building codes. So when we talk about the complexity of all the things that might impact these markets, here we have a transportation technology, we have an electricity grid, and we have building codes. Those are just a few things. And I know that they've been pushing for including more EV charging, or like the right, I guess, to EV charging in some multifamily homes. So that's one example of other entities out there paying attention to that article. I myself personally, I think I've told this a few stories. Just I also think about solar. So solar PV also had a similar issue in the beginning. There was issues of equity, and there still are. The net metering rules actually in California just changed to sort of respond to some of that. But of course, solar, there were new business models like solar leasing, where people could get solar with no money down. Now there's Schneider Electric, obviously, which acquired AutoGrid recently, has energy as a service models for microgrid. So I think what's going to happen is we are going to see more creative business models combined with all these different forces to try to address the equity issue. So, but let's think about the future here. We're talking about the future. We're talking about the present as well, but with artificial intelligence being incorporated into VPPs and the ability to shape load and all the things that Flex can do, manage demand peaks, what do you see as the next wave of opportunities for energy providers, Mimi, with with harnessing EVs for the grid?
Yeah, so I see a few things. And I think one of them, Joanne mentioned, I think we're going to see a shift from just looking at EVs as a demand response resource to a daily load shifting resource where we're using it to shape the load throughout the day, not only stopping people from charging, but encouraging them to charge at times when we have maybe too much solar on the grid. So I see that as an area where a lot of our customers are asking questions about. I also see EVs as not only like a peak load concern, but even maybe in some places, more importantly, a concern at the distribution level, the distribution transformer level, where you have many EVs and a localized population, on one substation, then you start to have a potential transformer capacity issue. And being able to visualize these EVs on your grid topography and then being able to control it at that level is going to be essential. And I feel very excited to be at AutoGrid because we have a long history, not only in EVs, but in energy storage. So we have a lot of those capabilities built into our platform already. And then I think the third area of where we're going is V2G. Like I said, I think it's real. I agree with you, Peter, that I see V2G being an area of great opportunity within fleets, whether it's school bus fleets or delivery fleets, but fleets with a more regular schedule. But I also see it as a great opportunity within the residential sector, because though a single consumer might be less predictable, and you might think that, oh, there's not that much opportunity with V2G with that type of unpredictableness. When you start talking about a large population, that population can be quite predictable statistically. So I see that's where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing which I didn't quite realize is that actually the storage capacity in EV is much larger than the typical stationary battery installed, at a residence. And so that means that potential is even bigger. Obviously, in a place like California that has a mandate with EVs, that's going to be a major opportunity. I failed to mention, and some people have noticed, we have another poll that we posted out there about how are you thinking about managing EV charging in your territory. So for those who didn't notice the poll, please weigh in. And while we're waiting for some more results, let's hear from Joanne again about what's next at CPA when it comes to this. You've talked quite a bit about what you're doing, but as you gaze into your crystal ball, perhaps some programs that haven't quite announced yet, what do you see in the future?
Yeah, great question. And, I think that from our perspective, what keeps me up at night a lot is this idea that we're promoting, electrification, both of transportation and buildings, and without kind of thoughtful planning and kind of automation, that those loads could potentially be leveraged during times of the day that are high cost or otherwise have grid strain. And so I think a lot about how do we manage those loads, but how do we do it in a way that is customer friendly, adds value to customers in the market, and doesn't disrupt what folks are doing, so that they actually engage and participate, and also so that it can be something that they can kind of set and forget. and won't impact their kind of day-to-day lives. And so, it's really finding that intersection of the technology, which all of us here love to geek out about and talk about and think about, with, how people use these devices and equipment, and making sure that ultimately we're not making kind of the perfect technical program for a small population. Instead, we're, making something that really can address and serve larger groups of people. So that's something that keeps me up at night, and it's something that I think is really important to continue to talk about and focus on. I also did want to address V2G, and I agree, Mimi, I think it's real. I do wonder, when it's going to be a meaningful resource, and kind of what the timeline of that is. There's, I think, rightfully so, more focus right now on fleets, because they're larger, they tend to be more sophisticated, they represent, kind of a bigger opportunity. And so we see those pilots going, and I think they're really informative. But it's going to be interesting to see how that works at the residential scale. I think there was a question in the chat about technology, right? So you need the EV, but you also need an inverter, and you need, some sort of either, software to enable kind of the use of that vehicle as a grid resource. And so, I think if you were today to ask the average consumer, I'm thinking about my mom or kind of friends and family, to do that, I don't think you'd get a great result. So again, we have to really think about not just solving for the technology, but solving for how people use energy.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I wanted to here look at the poll results. So I guess, how are you thinking about utilizing managing EV charging in your territory? 81% of those who responded said demand response, 61% said daily load shifting, 42% said time of use tariffs, and 35% distribution capacity control.
And actually, Peter, that brings up a really good point that I meant to speak about last.
Okay, go for it.
It was around the time of use rates, or time variant rates, dynamic rates, whatever you want to call them. I think that is a huge part of this equation. I've been talking a lot about how do you add value to the consumer, to the customer, and the rate structure, hopefully a simplified rate structure, can be a really great way to do that, and to send those price signals and make sure that the value's there. Because, certainly for a load serving entity, the value is there, right? The cost of procurement during peak times, during grid strain, during winter, it turns out, are really significant. And so if we can bring those costs down, and procure less during those times, we can save the entire customer base significant amounts of money. So, the more we can invest in kind of shaving that load and managing that, the better off we are. And I think pricing can be a huge asset there.
Sure.
Yeah, and just to add like a anecdote, I mean, I think one thing that I hear, I think the results of that poll are very representative to actually what I hear, which is like a huge diversity of the way utilities are approaching EVs, and a lot of utilities actually being like, I want to do all of the above, I just don't know which one I want to do first. But one interesting point about time of use rates is that I think some people are also thinking about EV programs as alternatives to time of use rates, where, getting a new time of use rate rolled out to your customer base is maybe a huge administrative haul. But by doing daily load shifting managed charging, you can achieve very similar results. Yeah, that's just another use case that I see.
Sure. Well, let's get to some of the questions here, as we have to wrap up here fairly soon. One of the questions is sort of related to V2G. I guess it's, to make EVs bidirectional, what does this require? Upgrades to hardware, software for cars, meters, chargers? Maybe that's a question for you, Mimi.
I mean, I'm not quite an expert in V2G hardware, but yes, it requires upgrades, I think, for the charger hardware, the vehicle, the inverter. It requires interconnection agreements with the utilities. So definitely it requires a lot. And then it requires a software platform, which, that's what AutoGrid has developed to help manage that. So to me, I see right now the biggest barriers to V2G being just like, getting more equipment out there that's V2G enabled at the right price point, and then the utilities on board to compensate that and
Compensate.
allow the interconnection.
Right. I mean, I think what I've heard is that the Nissan Leaf is one of the few cars that has been bidirectional and V2G capable, for quite some time, but the other OEMs have not, made that a focus, although they are becoming more interested. But of course, again, they are automakers first, and so that's not their top priority. Let's see, we have a lot of questions here. I don't know if Mimi or Joanne, if you see any questions you particularly wanted to speak to, go for it too.
I think there's one question here that says the VPP model undeniably makes sense, but a lot of us aren't equipped to set up community outreach programs. It seems like a huge endeavor that we might not be staffed or skilled for. So asking for a comment and a question. I think that's like a common sentiment we hear from organizations like mid-sized organizations, small organizations that are interested in harnessing VPPs. And I'd be very interested in hearing Joanne's point of view, but I think that's why from AutoGrid's point of view, we now offer this turnkey VPP product, which includes the full range of services to help a small organization like a CCA that doesn't have hundreds of people to staff on this type of program to do the program design. We help with the recruitment, we help with the dispatch, we help with the incentive payouts, and I hope that will help make VPPs more prolific, not only amongst larger organizations, but smaller load serving entities also.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'd add to that, and it's I have compassion. You're not alone in that struggle, right? In terms of having resources to do all the things we'd like to. From my perspective, it's about making the value proposition organizationally. So, what does a program like this bring to the organization? For us, it is helping, we actually, it's a market-facing program, so we're actively trading the resource in CAISO, and that generates revenue. We're also, hoping to reduce resource adequacy requirements by reducing that load. But as we've been mentioning, it's also about trying to purchase less expensive energy when we can help it. And so, I encourage you to think through, and a framework might be different in different, policy regions, but what that value proposition is to your organization. And I think if it pencils out, then usually that's a way to get resources or to justify, spending on consultants or whatever else might be the case.
Sure. Well, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. Maybe I'll just answer one quickly. There's a question about, we've been talking about the potential of VPPs for the past decade, and everything seems to be about forward-looking or the future, what's being done today. Well, I would say that VPPs are here and now. They're also real, like V2G. And I think we've been so focused on the US on this webinar, but this is a global market. In fact, some might argue Europe is one of the more advanced markets. Australia, where AutoGrid is very active, is a very big VPP market. Japan comes to mind. So this is a global phenomenon, but a lot of it will depend on market structure. So that's where I think what we're talking about is the technologies there. What's really needs to happen is figuring out, and especially with EVs, as Mimi is pointing out, is compensation. You need to have a way to get paid for the services you deliver. And this is, an issue with a lot of DERs, even with microgrids. I remember hearing that there was a microgrid in California that responded to a utility to island as a demand response resource, but it pointed out it was not paid for that service because there wasn't a scheme in place for that. So I think that's really a lot of this comes down to figuring out how to compensate for all these kind of new ways to deliver services that traditionally maybe were provided by fossil fuel generators. And obviously in California, we have mandates to reduce carbon, so that's why a lot of the action is happening here. There was a question about cybersecurity, and I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that. I think there are some people saying with all, oh yeah, vulnerability of critical infrastructure, don't risks rise with all these new connected devices vendors? Maybe that's for you, Mimi?
I mean, I would say I am not the expert in cybersecurity in AutoGrid, but I know that within AutoGrid, cybersecurity is a huge concern for us, and it's a huge priority. I think with cybersecurity, also there's the idea of privacy, which on EVs is a huge concern, because you start now managing a consumer's asset like an EV. You need to control that data, and we provide our customers like full transparency of how that data is being used to maintain customer privacy.
Right. And that's an issue with solar systems in your home as well, or there has been some hesitation, but I guess I would point out is that there are ways of doing this in a cyber secure manner. Just like, the larger grid, there have been cyber attacks on the grid, not that common, but that is, there are ways of addressing some of those challenges. Obviously, that is key to making all this work. Here's one question, maybe this is more easier, about, is any auto manufacturer giving anyone access to EV telematics? That seems like that's more up your alley there, maybe.
That one is a bit more up my alley. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. I'm trying to make it easy on you. I'm trying to make it easy.
So I think there's a lot of there's a huge diversity of approaches in terms of the telematics. There are a lot of auto OEMs starting to play in the space of trying to provide these types of services and engage in these types of VPP programs with their customers. My experience is that auto OEMs, like any other vendor, are highly concerned with their customers' experience, and they want to maintain that customer experience, maintain that customer privacy of data. And for that reason, a lot of them want to serve as the gateway to that customer. So some are working directly with, DERMS providers, VPP providers, and utilities to provide telematics-based dispatch. There's the OVGIP protocol as an example. I think there's also other third-party API providers that provide, telematics-based dispatch. So this is a highly evolving space. I think in the end, we'll probably see auto OEMs being a huge player in this, but it's evolving.
Sure. And of course, they're not used to necessarily thinking about their products and what role they play in the electricity market. So that's part of the evolution here. So I guess wanted to ask Joanne a question here before we have to wrap up. What's the best way to reach out and engage EV owners and potential EV owners about emerging opportunities to leverage EVs as a grid resource? Any ideas on that, or anything that you'd like to highlight at CPA?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess I'm not going to give you an easy answer, so apologize, but a couple of things to consider. One, customer segmentation and understanding who your customers are, who's driving EVs, what type of buildings they're in, what their demographics are, what language they speak is going to be critical to making sure that any of the messaging, gets to the customers, resonates, and is something that will ultimately take action on. Another thing I would food for thought is that, it's important to have the voice of the customer in your design process as you're thinking through different options. And so if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to start by talking to customers and trying to understand, what they value and what they're interested in, what the barriers might be, so that you can consider that. Because to be honest, you're trying to break through to people who are already busy and have other things to think about. And so you really need to make sure that it's adding value to their day-to-day lives.
Sure. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I don't know, Mimi, any final words about maybe We've talked about so much, so I don't know how you want to sum this all up, but any final comments?
Well, I just wanted to thank you and Joanne for this great webinar. I've learned some things. I hope everyone else has learned some things, and I'm super excited about what AutoGrid is doing in the e-mobility space. So if you're an energy service provider, if you're a fleet, if you're even an OEM partner, we would love to work with you. So reach out to me on LinkedIn or through whatever channel our marketing team has established, and we would love to continue the discussion.
All right, and Joanne, you've got 3 seconds. No, you've got a few seconds. Any final words?
I'll try to be quick. I mean, I think that hopefully what's come through today is there a lot of kind of proven pathways and proven solutions and success to point to, but we still have a large way to go, to get to that kind of clean energy future that we're hoping to achieve. And so I think venues like this, where we can share information and have dialogue, are critical. And so I'm super open to continuing that with anyone who's interested, as a way to continue to advance, these offerings across the board.
Yes, and I mentioned we didn't get to all the questions, but we will try to answer them via email. So with that, I think we'll have to sign off. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.